Rama 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 Hari Rama Hari Rama 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 Hari 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 Krishna Hari Rama Rama Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna. Okay, Hare Krishna. Okay, devotees, Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachadeshatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchikalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Prabhupada-lilamrita ki jai. Okay, devotees, we are in chapter 22. And let's see, where are we? Swami invites the hippies. And let's see where we are here. Yeah, okay. So here we are. Prabhupada's in San Francisco and dealing with all these very bizarre people, actually. Very bizarre. Heavily drugged. Really, really heavily drugged. And just sort of really out of it, people incredibly out of it. Living on the street and just in a very pathetic situation, thinking they're getting enlightenment through LSD. So even while translating in the privacy of his room, Srila Prabhupada was interrupted by disturbances. Once police cars and ambulances, sirens screaming, lights flashing, converged beneath his window after the Hells Angels had started a fight in the digger's store in the next building. On another occasion, about 1:30 a.m., while Prabhupada was dictating teachings of Lord Chaitanya. A girl repeatedly knocked and called at Prabhupada's door. At first, he ignored the interruption. Since his arrival in San Francisco, he had completed many pages for this important book. Lord Chaitanya's discussions with Rupa Goswami and Sanatan Goswami, Ramananda Roy, and others explored many Krishna-conscious topics mentioned only briefly in Bhagavad Gita. In the West, almost no one knew about these teachings of Lord Chaitanya. And now Srila Prabhupada intended to compile these teachings in one volume, providing the most complete presentation of Bhakti Yoga ever introduced in English. Such a book would give great substance to the Krishna consciousness movement, but now his solitary concentration was being interrupted by a knocking at his door and a woman's voice calling. Getting up from his desk, Prabhupada went to the front room, but did not open the door. "Who is there?" A young woman answered, "I want to speak to you." "Come back later in the morning," Prabhupada told her. He knew that in San Francisco, just as in New York, he would not always be able to write peacefully. Preaching in America meant having to tolerate just this, a crazy call in the middle of the night, tearing one away from ecstatic concentration on the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya. The lost souls of Haight-Ashbury, with their illusions of knowledge, their cries for help, their arrogant challenges, pulled his attention away from his mission of translating and commenting on the scriptures. Now, alone in his apartment, speaking through the locked door, Prabhupada told his intruder that he had work to do and that she should go away. He promised he would see her later that day. He was ready to speak with the hippies all day, but the early morning hours were the special time for his literary work. Preaching face-to-face to the conditioned souls was important. He had come here to preach, but he had picked these early hours to speak intimately to the whole world through his books without disturbance. The girl, however, continued pounding and calling, "Oh, Krishna," until Prabhupada finally opened the door. There, standing in the hallway, he saw a teenage hippie with a glassy stare and deranged appearance. He asked her what she wanted. She remained tensely silent. "Speak," he told her. She stepped into his room. He saw her helpless, a victim in the ocean of Maya, and he asked her repeatedly what she wanted. Finally, the girl stared at him with widened eyes and exclaimed, "Look, Mahaula!" Seriously. Prabhupada decided to awaken Mukunda, who lived down the hall. He stepped barefoot into the hallway. The girl followed, shutting the self-locking door behind her. Now he was locked out of his apartment. She continued to stare at him defiantly in the bare, unfriendly surroundings of a corridor of locked doors at 1 a.m. This was why the Babajis of Vrindavan stayed in their little cottages, chanting the holy name. to avoid being bothered by ungodly people. The Babajis, of course, never even dreamed of these bizarre intrusions from the psychedelic San Francisco night. At Mukunda's door, Prabhupada began pounding and calling loudly, "Mukunda, Mukunda!" Mukunda awoke and opened the door, astonished to see his spiritual master standing barefoot in the hallway, a wild-eyed young girl standing a few feet behind. Yet Prabhupada remained grave and aloof. "This girl came to my door," he began. He explained briefly what had happened and what should now be done. He did not appear angry or harassed by the girl, and he indicated that Mukunda should deal kindly with her. Mukunda remembered when Prabhupada had been driven out of his New York Bowery loft by his roommate, David Allen, who had gone mad on LSD. Then also Prabhupada had remained cool-headed, though caught by a dangerous and awkward circumstance. Mukunda went downstairs and awoke Hayagriva, who had a key to Prabhupada's apartment. Srila Prabhupada then returned to his room and to his dictation of teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Mukunda saw the girl down to the street and admonished her not to bother an elderly gentleman like the Swami at such an hour. Staring at Mukunda, she said, "You're not ready," and walked away. At 7 o'clock, when Prabhupada came down to the temple for the morning class, the girl was sitting in the audience in a calmer state of mind. She apologized. Later in the day, Prabhupada repeated the story in good humor, recounting how he had several times asked the girl to speak. He opened his eyes wide, imitating her expression, and said, "Look, Mahaula," and laughed. Krishna, Prabhupada. "We shall go for a walk at 6:30, Srila Prabhupada said one morning. "You can drive me to the park." Several devotees accompanied him to Golden Gate Park's Stowe Lake. They knew the park well and led Srila Prabhupada on a scenic walk around the lake, over a bridge, through forest-enclosed paths, and across a small rivulet, hoping to please him with nature's beauty. As he walked, striding quickly, he would point to a tree or stop to examine a flower. "What is this tree?" he would ask. "What is this flower?" Although his disciples were usually at a loss to answer. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu passed through the forest of Vrindavan, he said, all the plants, trees, and creepers were delighted to see him and rejoiced in his presence. The plant life there is like that in the spiritual sky, fully conscious. And these trees, Swamiji, how conscious are they? Oh, the spirit soul is there, Prabhupada said, but the consciousness has been arrested temporarily. Perception is more limited. Whatever Prabhupada saw, he saw through the eyes of Scripture, and his comments on the most ordinary things were full of transcendental instruction. As he walked, he reflected aloud. Those who want to see God must first have the qualifications to see God. They must be purified. Just like the cloud is now covering the sun. They say, oh, the sun is not out, but the sun is there. Only our eyes are covered. Like tour guides, the boys led Prabhupada to the more picturesque areas. They came upon swans gliding on the lake. Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada said, compares devotees to swans, and literature about Lord Krishna to beautiful, clear lakes. The non-devotees, he said, were like crows attracted by the rubbish of mundane topics. Walking over a gravel path, he stopped and drew their attention. Look at the pebbles. As many pebbles there are that many universes. And in each universe, there are innumerable living entities. The devotees delighted in bringing Swamiji to a rhododendron glen, its big bushes completely covered with white and pink flowers. And they felt privileged to see Krishna through Swamiji's eyes. The next morning, when Prabhupada again wanted to go to the park, more devotees accompanied him. They had heard from the others how Swamiji had displayed a different mood while walking. Again, the boys were ready to lead him along new trails around the lake. But without announcing a change in plans, he walked up and down the tar-sealed road beside the lake. Prabhupada and his followers came upon a flock of sleeping ducks. Awakened by the sound of people walking on the path, the ducks began quacking, moving their wings and walking away. When a few devotees hurried ahead to shoo the ducks from Prabhupada's path, the ducks began making sounds of grouching and grumbling. "Move, you ducks," one devotee said. "You're disturbing Swamiji." Prabhupada said quietly, "As we're thinking they're disturbing us, they're thinking we're disturbing them." Prabhupada stopped beneath a large tree and pointed to some bird droppings on the ground. "What does this mean?" he asked, turning to a new boy who stood beside him. Prabhupada's face was serious. The boy blushed. I don't know what it means." Prabhupada remained thoughtful, waiting for an explanation. The devotees gathered around him. Looking intently down at the bird droppings, the boy thought the Swami might be expecting him to decipher some hidden meaning in the pattern of the droppings, the way people read the future in tea leaves. He felt he should say something. It's the excreta, the defecations of birds. Prabhupada smiled and turned toward the others for an answer. They were silent. "It means," said Prabhupada, "that these birds," he pronounced the word bards, "have lived in the same tree for more than 2 weeks." He laughed. "Even the birds are attached to their apartments." As they passed the shuffleboard courts and the old men playing checkers, Prabhupada stopped and turned to the boys. "Just see," he said, "old people in this country do not know what to do, so they play like children, wasting their last days, which should be meant for developing Krishna consciousness. Their children are grown and gone away, So this is a natural time for spiritual cultivation. But no, they get some cat or dog, and instead of serving God, they serve dog. It is most unfortunate. But they will not listen. Their ways are set. Therefore, we're speaking to the youth who are searching. When Prabhupada and the boys passed a sloping green lawn just off Kesar Drive, the boys pointed out that this was the famous Hippie Hill. In the early morning, the gently sloping hill and the big quiet meadow surrounded by eucalyptuses and oaks were silent and still. But in a few hours, hundreds of hippies would gather there to lounge on the grass, meet friends, and get high. Prabhupada advised the boys to come here and hold kirtans. Okay, so now we have come to chapter 23, the Price Affair. Price is Mr. Price, the real estate agent from New York. Swamiji's disciples in New York were surprised to find that they could still carry on in his absence. At first, rising early, going to the storefront, and holding the morning kirtan in class had been difficult. Without Swamiji, everything had seemed empty. But he had taught them what to do, and gradually they realized that they should simply follow what he had shown them, or even imitate, as a child imitates his parents. And it worked. At first they had been too shy to speak or lead the kirtan, so they had played tapes of Swamiji's kirtans and classes. But when the evenings came and guests attended the temple, the devotees felt compelled to give live classes. Roy Ram, Brahmananda, Satswarup, and Rupanuga took turns giving brief talks and even answering challenging questions from the same Lower East Side audiences that Srila Prabhupada had lion-tamed for 6 months. Things were shaky and lacking without him, and yet in a sense he was still present. And the devotees found that everything, the chanting, the cooking, the taking of prasadam, the preaching, could still go on. On January 19th, just 3 days after his arrival in San Francisco, Prabhupada had written back to his New York disciples. They were his spiritual children and were very dear to him. Although far from his homeland, India, he hadn't thought first of writing to anyone there. Since he was a sannyasi, he had no interest in writing to any family members or relatives. And as for writing to his godbrothers, there was not much importance in that, since they had repeatedly shown their reluctance to help. But being in a new city, among new faces, and having met with an initial fanfare of success, Prabhupada had wanted to share the news with those most eager to hear from him. He had also wanted to reassure his disciples whom, after only a few months of training, he was expecting to conduct the Krishna consciousness movement in New York. So here's the letter from the letter. My dear Brahmananda, Hayagriva, Kirtanananda, Satswarup, Gargamuni, Achutananda, Jadharani, please accept my greetings and blessings of Guru Gauranga Giridhari Gandhavika. You've already got the news of our safe arrival and good reception by the devotees here. Mr. Allen Ginsberg and about 50 or 60 others received us on the airport, and when I arrived in my apartment, there were some press reporters also who took note of my mission. 2-3 papers like the Examiner and the Chronicles, etc., have already published the report. One of the reports is sent herewith, please find. I wish that 1,000 copies of this report may be offset printed at once, and 100 copies of the same may be sent here as soon as possible. I understand that you're feeling my absence. Krishna will give you strength. Physical presence is immaterial. Presence of the transcendental sound received from the spiritual master should be the guidance of life. That will make our spiritual life successful. If you feel very strongly about my absence, you may place my pictures on my sitting places, and this will be source of inspiration for you. I'm very much anxious to hear about the final decision of the house. I wish to open the house by the 1st of March, 1967. An arrangement may be done dexterously in this connection. I have not as yet received the tapes for dictaphone, and I've sent you tapes yesterday. Please offer my blessings to Shriman Neil. Sriam Roy Ran is cooking well and distributing prasadam to the devotees, numbering sometimes 70. It is very encouraging. I think the center will be a very nice branch without delay. Everything is prospective. Hope you are well and awaiting your early reply. This letter had helped, especially the second paragraph. Let's just check it again. The second. I understood that you're feeling my absence. Krishna will give you strength. Physical presence is immaterial. Presence of the transcendental sound received from the spiritual master should be the guidance of life. That will make our spiritual life successful. If you feel very strongly about my absence, you may place my pictures on my sitting places, and this will be the source of inspiration for you. So the letter had helped, and particularly that paragraph. Brahmananda had posted it in the storefront. Now Swamiji had clearly enunciated that they were still with him, and he was still in New York with them. It was something special, service to the spiritual master in separation. And even the devotees in San Francisco who were with Swamiji every day could not yet know its special taste. While the devotees in New York performed their daily duties, they often quoted from the letter and thought about it. Krishna will give you strength. Physical presence is immaterial. Presence of the transcendental sound received from the spiritual master should be the guidance of life. That will make our spiritual life successful. Although Prabhupada had written that they could place his photograph on his seat, no one had a photograph. Whew, Krishna, Krishna. They had to ask the devotees in San Francisco for one. A boy took some poor color snapshots and sent them to New York. And the devotees placed one at Prabhupada's sitting place in his apartment. It helped. For Prabhupada also, The letter to his disciples in New York marked a milestone. This was the basis on which he hoped to conduct a world movement. He could travel from place to place and yet be simultaneously present in many places by his instructions. Brahmananda, as president of the New York Temple, frequently phoned San Francisco. The chanting is the focal point, he told Hayagriva. We can always sit and chant. We're beginning to understand what Swamiji meant when he said that worship in separation is more relishable. And Srila Prabhupada wrote to his New York disciples regularly, at least once a week. Brahmananda got most of the business instructions, arranged to purchase a new building in New York, see Mr. Kalman, and get copies of the Kirtan record, get a copy of the movie a filmmaker had made of the devotees, investigate the possibility of publishing Bhagavad Gita. If I am assisted by one expert typewriter, Prabhupada wrote Brahmananda, we can publish every 3 months a book. And the more we have books, the more we become respectable. Satsvarup got a letter from Prabhupada asking him to type the dictated tapes of the new book, Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Although Prabhupada's typist, Neil, had gone to San Francisco, after a day he had disappeared. Things like that happen. I think you have 5 tapes with you, because I've got only 3 with me, Prabhupada wrote. See that the tapes do not miss. Satsvarup had written inquiring how he would be able to understand transcendental knowledge. You're a sincere devotee of the Lord, Prabhupada replied, and certainly he will bless you with auspicious advancement in the matter of spiritual understanding. Roy Ram got a letter encouraging him. Roy Ram got a letter encouraging him to continue publishing the magazine. Prabhupada said, Back to Godhead will always remain the backbone of our society. Your ambition should always be how to improve the quality. Achyutananda, one of the youngest devotees, only 18, was now working alone in the kitchen. In a letter Srila Prabhupada wrote to 5 devotees, signing his name 5 times, he told Achyutananda, since Kirtanananda is absent, certainly you're feeling some strain, but the more you serve Krishna, the more you become stronger. I hope you're being properly assisted by your other godbrothers. Prabhupada advised Gargamuni, also 18, to cooperate with his older godbrothers. Asking whether Gargamuni had gone to see his mother, Prabhupada said he hoped she was all right. Since Gargamuni was the temple treasurer, Srila Prabhupada advised him checks should be drawn with full deliberation. Prabhupada wrote Jadharani, I always remember you as the nicest girl because you are so devoutly engaged in the service of Krishna. She had informed him that she had been cheated by a boyfriend, and Srila Prabhupada replied, better you accept Krishna as your husband, and he will never be unfaithful. Devote yourself, therefore, 24 hours in the service of Krishna and see how you feel happy in all respects. Rupanuga had written Prabhupada that the temperature in New York had dropped below zero and that there had been a 2-day blizzard. Srila Prabhupada wrote, quote, "Certainly the situation would have been a little troublesome for me because I'm an old man. I think Krishna wanted to protect me by shifting me here at San Francisco. Here the climate is certainly like India, and I'm feeling comfortable, but uncomfortable also, because at New York I felt at home on account of so many beloved students like you. As you are feeling my absence, so I'm feeling for you. But we're all happy on account of Krishna consciousness, either here or there. May Krishna join us always in his transcendental service," unquote. The neophyte disciples in New York felt assurance from their spiritual master's words and by their own experience. Service in separation was a transcendental fact. They were improving in chanting on their beads, and the New York Center was going on. "So long our kirtan is all right," Prabhupada wrote, "there is no difficulty at all." But there was one difficulty. Attempts to purchase a new building, which had gone on smoothly while Prabhupada had been present, had become a great problem as soon as he had left. Shortly after Srila Prabhupada's departure for San Francisco, Brahmananda had given Mr. Price $1,000. And Mr. Price had promised to help the devotees get their building. When Prabhupada heard this, he became perturbed. In the opinion of the devotees and the trustees here, this is Prabhupada has written, in the opinion of the devotees and the trustees here, $1,000 has been risked without any understanding. I know that you're doing your best, but still there has been an error of judgment. I'm not at all displeased with you, but they say that Mr. Price will never be able to secure financial help from any other source. He's simply taking time under different pretext, changing constantly. Therefore, you should not pay even a farthing more than what you've paid. A farthing's a quarter of one old British penny. If he wants any more money, you should flatly refuse. So it's very interesting, just an interesting point, that Brahmananda may well have lost $1,000. It's quite likely even, giving it to Mr. Price without any, contract, any documentation, probably without a receipt. But Prabhupada, he doesn't get outwardly angry. In fact, he says, I'm not at all displeased with you. This is the thing, that when we're dealing with devotees, particularly newer devotees, we have to be kind to them. Yes. And we can't treat them abrasively or, in any sort of unpleasant way. But we always have to encourage them, inspire them by what we say. Srila Prabhupada remembered Mr. Price in their first meeting, at which the blonde-haired, elegantly dressed businessman, his face tanned even in winter, had addressed him as Your Excellency. That address alone had made Prabhupada distrust him. There was a Bengali saying, too much devotion denotes a thief. Prabhupada knew that businessmen were prone to cheat, and that an American businessman would be particularly difficult to deal with. Prabhupada's American disciples were innocent children in worldly affairs. He was ready to instruct them step by step, but now, without consulting him, they'd become involved in an unbusinesslike transaction, risking $1,000 of the society's money without any written agreement. Yeah. $1,000 in those days was a lot. Okay. Srila Prabhupada had visited the building on Stuyvesant Street, and he wanted it. It was a historical, well-kept, aristocratic building, suitable for his New York headquarters. It was worth the $100,000 price if they could afford it. You know, by today's standards, 100,000 is nothing. I mean, it's really very little. But it was difficult for Prabhupada to know from San Francisco what was going on between Brahmananda and the businessman. And the difficulty increased as letters and phone calls from Brahmananda introduced other persons involved. Aside from Mr. Price, there was Mr. Tyler, the owner, and Mr. Tyler's lawyer, who seemed independent of Mr. Tyler. And finally, there was ISKCON's lawyer, who also had a mind of his own. Although Srila Prabhupada's disciples usually surrendered to his direction, they seemed bent on listening to the businessman's promises, even though their spiritual master had cautioned them not to. Prabhupada became disturbed. His preaching in San Francisco was being threatened by fears that the businessman would cheat his society of what he had begun in New York. With no responsible advisors to turn to, Srila Prabhupada sometimes discussed the problem with Mukunda and other devotees in his room. They all agreed that the transaction seemed highly irregular. Brahmananda was probably being led on by false promises. Brahmananda, however, saw Mr. Price as a rare person, a successful man who wanted to help the devotees. Although no other respectable businessman had ever shown interest, Mr. Price listened and sympathized, and he would greet the devotees with Hare Krishna. Brahmananda was well aware of the humble economic and social position of the devotees. They were almost all ex-hippies, and they were poor. But here was Mr. Price, a wealthy man with diamond cufflinks, who was always glad to see him, shake his hand, pat his back, and speak appreciatively of the religion of India and the moral behavior of the small band of devotees. Mr. Price had received a group of devotees as guests in his apartment and said nice things about each one of them. He said that Hayagriva was an excellent writer and that Back to Godhead was the best magazine on the market. And that its mimeographed appearance made it look even better than the slicks, means, the glossy magazines. He said he would give the devotees a movie projector, and he came close to saying that if he could liquidate some of his money, he would give them the building. I mean, if you believe stuff like that, that's just too extreme. Yeah. Brahmananda, who saw Mr. Price a few times a week, would come away intoxicated with high hopes. The Krishna consciousness movement could rise to success through this wealthy man's patronage. After leaving Mr. Price's office, Brahmananda would rejoin the devotees in the evening and tell them all that had happened. On nights when there were no public kirtans, the devotees would hold meetings. Swamiji had named them Ishtagoshtis to discuss the instructions of the spiritual master. And the Ishtagoshtis became dominated by talks of Mr. Price and the building. One night, Brahmananda explained why he had given Mr. Price $1,000. Mr. Price had asked for something to work with. It was like earnest money. And it was also for a trip Mr. Price had to take to Pittsburgh to see whether he could release some of his wealth to use in Krishna's service. One of the boys asked whether there'd be any receipt or written agreement. Swamiji had taught them to use receipts, at least amongst themselves. Gargamuni and Satsvarup, as treasurer and secretary, signed each voucher, and Gargamuni kept the vouchers on file. These included receipts for items like 50 cents for a hat and $3 for sneakers. Brahmananda said he had mentioned a written statement to Mr. Price, but hadn't pressed the matter. Anyway, it wasn't necessary or even desirable, since they were not simply conducting business with Mr. Price, but cultivating a relationship. Mr. Price was a well-wisher, a friend, who was helping them as charity. He was going to do big things and use his influence to get the building. This $1,000 was just a gesture to show their interest and to show Mr. Price's friends the devotees weren't joking. They had some money. In fact, the devotees had $10,000, $5,000 in small donations, and a $5,000 donation from a wealthy hippie. In addition to donations, the temple had a regular monthly income of $800, Brahmananda's $400 paycheck from his job as a substitute teacher for the New York City public school system, and the $400 paycheck Satsvarup earned as a caseworker for the welfare department. But the devotees were in no position to buy any building, and they knew it. All the more reason, Brahmananda explained at an Ishtagoshti, why they had to depend on Mr. Price. After all, he reasoned, Swamiji himself had inspired them to look for a $100,000 building. Swamiji knew they couldn't pay for such a building except in some extraordinary way. And Mr. Price, Brahmananda figured, must be the way. Swamiji wanted the building. No sooner had he reached San Francisco than he had written back, "I'm very anxious to hear about the final decision of the House. I wish to open the House by the 1st of March 1967. An arrangement may be done dexterously in this connection." The assembled devotees listened to Brahmananda's explanations, sympathized, and added their own understanding of how Krishna and Swamiji were working. There were a few contrary remarks and opinions, but basically everyone agreed. Brahmananda's dealings with Mr. Price were all right. When Kirtanananda and Roy Ram returned to New York from San Francisco, they consulted with Brahmananda. Then Brahmananda went to Price, who promised that if somehow they couldn't get the building, he would return at least $750. The balance of the money represented travel in the devotees' interest. But they would get the building, Mr. Price assured him. Then Mr. Price told Brahmananda the latest. He had found a wealthy financier, Mr. Hall, who had almost agreed to pay the full $100,000 for the building. Mr. Price was working on Mr. Hall, who happened to be his close friend. Prospects seemed good, but the devotees would also have to do their part, Mr. Price explained, by putting up $5,000. Mr. Price would then arrange everything else. Oh, Krishna. Mr. Price set up a meeting with an architect on Park Avenue. Park Avenue. It's like multi-million-dollar places. And soon Brahmananda and Satswarup were sitting with Mr. Price and his architect friend reviewing sketches. To give the building that authentic Indian temple look, the architect proposed a facade with arches and, if they liked, domes. It was wonderful. Of course, they didn't dare ask him how much it would cost, but Mr. Price even hinted that the work might be done free. Wow. After Mr. Price served himself and his architect friends some liquor and offered some to the boys, although he knew they wouldn't accept it, the two men held up tinkling glasses, smiled, and politely toasted themselves and the boys, saying, "Hare Krishna." Wow. While going down on the elevator, Mr. Price spoke eloquently of the devotee's faith in God. He said that others might argue about the existence of God, but the most convincing thing was the devotee's personal experience. Your personal testimony, Mr. Price assured them, is the best argument. It's a very powerful thing. The boys nodded. Later, among themselves, they laughed about the liquor, but still they figured these men wanted to help. When Srila Prabhupada heard about the latest developments, he did not share his disciples' optimism. On February 3rd, he wrote Gargamuni, quote, "I had a talk with your brother Brahmananda yesterday on the dial. I'm glad that Mr. Price has promised to return the amount of $750 in case no sale contract is made. But in any case, you should not pay any farthing more than what you've already paid, either to the lawyer or to Mr. Price, unless there's actual sale contract made. It appears to me very gloomy about the transaction, because there was no basic understanding before the payment of $1,000, either to the lawyer or to the real estate. This is not businesslike. Unless there's a basic understanding, where is the way of transaction? If there was no basic understanding, why so much waste of time and energy? I cannot understand. And if there was basic understanding, why has it changed so quickly? I'm therefore perturbed in the mind. When there's no basic understanding, what was the need for appointing a lawyer? Anyway, it is my advice that you should consult me before issuing any further money. But I hope you will make the transaction successful without further delay. Srila Prabhupada had also instructed Garga Muni to protect the $10,000 in the bank and never withdraw any sum that would leave a balance of less than 6,000. Prabhupada had left one account for which the devotees were the signers, but he also had an account for which he controlled the funds. He now asked the devotees to put $6,000 from their account into his. He wrote Brahmananda, "This $6,000 will be transferred forthwith by me as soon as there is a sale contract for purchase of the house." It's thrilling. Wow. Join us tomorrow for more. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna,